The frozen breath of Lieutenant Colonel William Wild Bill Peterson hung in the air, like ghostly warnings as he peered through the frost-covered periscope of his command bunker. It was December 15th, 1944, and the Ardennes forest stretched before him like a crystalline tomb, deceptively peaceful under its blanket of snow. Peterson commanded the 2nd Battalion of the 106th Infantry Division, and something in his gut told him this silence was wrong, terrifyingly wrong. "Sir, intelligence reports minimal enemy activity along our front," Sergeant Murphy reported, his voice barely above a whisper in the cramped observation post. The young man from Boston had seen enough combat in the past months to know that silence often preceded screaming. Peterson nodded grimly, remembering the classified briefings from 12th Army Group Headquarters. General Omar Bradley's staff had dismissed the Ardennes as a quiet sector, a place where green troops could get their feet wet and battle-worn veterans could rest. But Peterson had fought the Germans since Normandy, and he knew they were never truly quiet. According to military historian Stephen Ambrose's extensive research documented in Citizen Soldiers, the American High Command had gravely underestimated German capabilities in the winter of 1944. The forest that now seemed so tranquil to Peterson's eyes concealed the largest German offensive operation since the invasion of France in 1940. Across the frozen landscape, in the German positions that Peterson couldn't see, Field Marshal Walter Model was putting the finishing touches on Operation Whacked AM Rheinwatch on the Rhine. 3 entire armies, the 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, the 5th Panzer Army commanded by Hasso von Manteuffel, and the 7th Army led by Erich Brandenburger recoiled like springs in the dense forests. Peterson's radio crackled to life. "Charlie 6, this is base. Weather report shows heavy fog rolling in overnight. Visibility near zero expected." The lieutenant colonel acknowledged the transmission, but the weather was the least of his concerns. Unknown to him, that same fog would provide perfect cover for what German commanders had dubbed Der Nebel, the mist that would conceal the movement of over 100,000 enemy troops. Staff Sergeant Robert Hayes, a grizzled veteran from the Tennessee mountains, approached Peterson's position. His weathered face bore the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen too much death. Yet his instincts remained sharp as a blade. "Colonel, the men are nervous. Nothing we can put our finger on, but something's got the forest spooked. Even the birds ain't singing." Peterson knew Hayes spoke truth. The silence was unnatural, as if the very woods were holding their breath. In the German lines, assault troops of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandard Adolf Hitler were receiving their final briefings. Young soldiers, some barely out of their teens, listened as their officers spoke of breaking through American lines and driving to the sea. They had been told that success here could change the course of the war. As darkness fell on December 15th, Peterson made his rounds through the American positions. The men of the 106th Infantry Division had no idea. They stood directly in the path of the German 6th Panzer Army's main assault. Their foxholes, scattered thinly across miles of forest, would soon become the first line of defense against Hitler's last desperate offensive. The temperature dropped to 10 degrees below freezing that night. In just a few hours, the relative peace of the Ardennes would explode into chaos, and the Battle of the Bulge would begin with a thunderclap of artillery that would echo through military history. At precisely 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, 1944, the world exploded. The German artillery barrage began with a roar that shook snow from pine trees 20 miles away. Over 1,600 guns of every caliber, from the massive 8-inch railway cannons to the rapid-fire 20mm flak guns, pressed into ground service, opened fire simultaneously along an 85-mile front. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson was thrown from his cot in the command bunker as the first shells screamed overhead, their demonic whistle growing to a crescendo before erupting in fountains of earth, snow, and shrapnel. "Jesus Christ!" Sergeant Murphy shouted over the cacophony, blood trickling from his ears as he struggled to establish radio contact with the forward positions. The carefully laid telephone wires had been severed in the first minutes of the bombardment, leaving the scattered American units blind and isolated. The artillery preparation lasted 90 minutes of hell that reduced carefully prepared defensive positions to smoking craters and turned the peaceful Ardennes into a lunar landscape. Men who survived later described it as the most concentrated artillery barrage they experienced in the entire war. Private First Class Tommy Rodriguez from San Antonio pressed himself into the bottom of his foxhole, praying the rosary his mother had given him as 88mm shells burst around his position, like the wrath of God. As the barrage finally lifted at 7 o'clock, an even more terrifying sound emerged from the mist. the deep, mechanical growl of panzer engines and the synchronized tramp of thousands of boots. The German infantry emerged from the fog like gray phantoms, their coal scuttle helmets and white winter camouflage, making them appear as spirits of the forest itself. Staff Sergeant Hayes, commanding what remained of Charlie Company's 3rd Platoon, watched in horror as the first German assault troops appeared through the drifting smoke. "They're everywhere," he shouted into his radio handset, not knowing if anyone could hear him. "Krauts coming through the wire. We need reinforcement now." The German plan, as documented in post-war interrogation records maintained by the U.S. Army Historical Division, was audacious in its scope and desperate in its execution. Hitler had scraped together his last reserves elite SS divisions, seasoned Wehrmacht units, and even hastily trained Volkssturm militia for this final roll of the dice. The 6th Panzer Army's objective was to punch through American lines and race for the Meuse River bridges, then went north toward Antwerp. These were veteran formations, filled with battle-hardened soldiers who had fought from Normandy to the German border. But the Americans, though surprised and outnumbered, were not broken. At the village of Lanzereth, 18 men of the Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon of the 99th Infantry Division held up an entire German regiment for most of the day, led by 2nd Lieutenant Lyle Boak Jr. These soldiers turned a few wooden buildings into a fortress that delayed the German timetable by crucial hours. Peterson's battalion faced the full weight of the German assault. As Tiger tanks crashed through the tree line, their 88mm guns blazing, he realized his thin line of defense was crumbling. The German breakthrough was happening faster than anyone had anticipated. Young soldiers who had been writing letters home just hours earlier now fought for their lives. With bayonets and grenades in hand-to-hand combat among the snow-laden pines, fall back to the secondary positions, Peterson ordered, his voice hoarse from shouting commands over the din of battle. But there were no secondary positions. The American commanders had never expected a major German offensive through the Ardennes. The men would have to improvise, fight, and die where they stood. By noon on December 16th, the German offensive had achieved complete tactical surprise along the entire front. American units were in full retreat, scattered and confused, while German spearheads raced westward toward their objectives. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and in those first crucial hours, it seemed that Hitler's gamble might actually succeed. The village of St. Vith became the eye of the hurricane on December 17th, 1944. Major General Alan Jones, commanding the 106th Infantry Division, stared at the tactical map with growing alarm. Red pins marking German breakthrough points dotted the display like spots of blood, and the situation reports flowing into his headquarters painted a picture of unfolding disaster. "Sir, we've lost contact with the 4th 22nd and 23rd Infantry Regiments," reported Colonel Charles Cavender, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Last transmission indicated they were surrounded near Schnee Eifel. Jones rubbed his weathered face with trembling hands. In less than 36 hours, his division had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. Two entire regiments, over 8,000 men, had been cut off and surrounded by the rapid German advance. The Golden Boys of the 6th SS Panzer Army had accomplished in one day what Allied intelligence had deemed impossible. Meanwhile, 60 miles to the north, the German 5th Panzer Army, under General Hassel von Manteuffel, was achieving even greater success. Their objective was the vital road junction of Bastogne, a small Belgian town whose capture would give the Germans control of the entire southern Ardennes transportation network. Racing toward this prize was the 2nd Panzer Division, spearheaded by their reconnaissance battalion under Major Ernst von Laukert. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills as von Laukert's Panzer IV tanks rolled through the village of Clairvaux, their tracks crushing the cobblestones that had witnessed centuries of peaceful Luxembourgish life. Behind them came the mechanized infantry, their half-tracks loaded with veteran soldiers who had fought from the steppes of Russia to the beaches of Normandy. Standing in their path was Lieutenant Colonel Hurley Fuller's 110th Infantry Regiment, a Pennsylvania National Guard unit that had been relegated to what commanders thought was the quietest sector of the front. Fuller had deployed his men in the stone buildings of Clairvaux, turning the medieval town into a fortress. But medieval walls, no matter how thick, offered little protection against modern German panzers. As documented in Charles MacDonald's definitive account, A Time for Trumpets, the defense of Clairvaux became an epic of American courage against impossible odds. Fuller's men fought from house to house, floor by floor, using bazookas and sticky grenades against German armor in point-blank duels that left the ancient streets littered with burning vehicles and broken stone. Sergeant William Lance, a coal miner from Scranton, found himself face to face with the German Mark IV tank in the town square, armed only with a bazooka and two rockets. He waited until the Panzer was 30 yards away before firing. His first shot bounced off the frontal armor, but the second penetrated the side plating, turning the tank into a funeral pyre for its crew. Americans fight like devils, radioed Oberst Meinrad von Laukert, commanding the 2nd Panzer Division, to his corps' headquarters. The German advance, which had proceeded like clockwork for 2 days, was beginning to slow as American resistance stiffened. But the most crucial development was occurring in a nondescript farmhouse outside the village of Verdun, where General Dwight Eisenhower's chief of staff, General Walter Bedell Smith, was coordinating the Allied response to the German offensive. The Supreme Allied commander had been attending a wedding in London when news of the attack arrived, but he was now racing back to his headquarters at Versailles. Ike wants every available reserve moved to the Ardennes immediately, Smith announced to the assembled staff officers. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions are being trucked north from their rest areas. The British 21st Army Group is being alerted for possible commitment. The decision to commit the strategic reserve showed that the Allied High Command finally understood the magnitude of the German threat. The 82nd Airborne, commanded by Major General James Gavin, and the 101st Airborne under Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, were the elite of the American Army. These were the paratroopers who had jumped into Normandy and Holland, veterans who had earned their reputation in blood. As December 17th drew to a close, the German offensive had penetrated up to 12 miles into American lines at several points. The 6th SS Panzer Army was approaching the Meuse River, while Mandeufel's 5th Panzer Army was bearing down on Bastogne. But the Americans were no longer surprised, no longer scattered and confused. The real battle for the Ardennes was about to begin. December 22nd, 1944. The word nuts echoed through military history as Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe penned his famous reply to German surrender demands. But few knew the desperate circumstances that led to that defiant response, or the hellish conditions endured by the encircled defenders of Bastogne. The town sat at the center of a web of 7 roads that radiated outward like spokes of a wheel, making it the key to controlling movement throughout the southern Ardennes. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the battle, and both sides knew it. The race to reach the town had become a matter of hours, with German spearheads and American reinforcements converging from opposite directions. Major William Desabry, commanding Combat Command Baker of the 10th Armored Division, had arrived in Bastogne just ahead of the German 5th Panzer Army's advance guard. His small force of Sherman tanks and armored infantry represented the only organized resistance between the German panzers and their objective. As dawn broke on December 20th, Desabry found himself facing elements of the elite Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's finest armored formations. "They're coming up the road from Margaret," reported Captain William Ryerson over the radio, his voice tight with tension. "Looks like a full company of panzers, maybe more. We're engaging now." The Battle of Novel erupted with the distinctive crack of high-velocity tank guns echoing across the frozen farmland. Desabry's Shermans, outgunned but not outfought, played a deadly game of hide-and-seek among the stone farmhouses and hedgerows. The German Panther tanks, with their powerful 75mm guns, could penetrate Sherman armor at ranges exceeding a mile, but the Americans used superior mobility and intimate knowledge of the terrain to even the odds. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard, operations officer of the 101st Airborne Division, had arrived in Bastogne with the division's advance party just hours before the German ring closed completely. The paratroopers, still wearing summer uniforms and lacking proper winter equipment, took up positions in the freezing foxholes that would become their homes for the next week. According to Stephen Ambrose's interviews with Bastogne veterans, documented in Band of Brothers, the conditions inside the perimeter were beyond description. Men suffered from frostbite, trench foot, and exposure while subsisting on K-rations and melted snow. Medical supplies ran critically short, forcing doctors to perform amputations without anesthesia and treat wounds with strips torn from parachute silk. The German news tightened daily. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, commanding the 47th Panzer Corps, had 3 full divisions surrounding the town: the 2nd Panzer, the Panzer Lehr, and the 26th Volksgrenadier. His artillery pounded the American positions around the clock, while his infantry probed for weaknesses in the hastily constructed defensive line. "We have you surrounded," read the German ultimatum delivered under a white flag on December 22nd. "There is only one possibility to save the encircled USA. Troops from total annihilation, That is the honorable surrender of the encircled town. McAuliffe's one-word reply, nuts, was delivered by Colonel Joseph Harper, who had to explain to the puzzled German officers that it meant go to hell. The response electrified not just the defenders of Bastogne, but the entire Allied world when news correspondents reported the exchange. But defiance alone would not save the town. Ammunition was running critically low, medical supplies were exhausted, and the men were beginning to show signs of combat fatigue that bordered on shell shock. The German attacks were intensifying, with SS troops launching fanatical assaults against the American lines under cover of darkness. On Christmas Eve, the situation became desperate when German armor broke through the perimeter near the village of Champs. Captain Preston Towns, commanding Easy Company of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, found his position overrun by German tanks and infantry, armed with nothing but rifles, grenades, and bazookas. His paratroopers fought a running battle through the snow-covered woods. "We held them at the creek bed," Towns later reported. "Lost half my company doing it, but we held." The creek bed became known to survivors as Purple Heart Creek for the casualties suffered there. The weather, which had grounded Allied aircraft for days, finally began to clear on December 23rd. The first C-47 transport planes appeared over Bastogne at noon, their cargo holds packed with ammunition, medical supplies, and Christmas dinner for the beleaguered defenders. Fighter bombers followed, their machine guns and rockets tearing into German positions with devastating effect. But the most crucial development was occurring 30 miles to the south, where General George Patton's Third Army was executing one of the most remarkable tactical movements in military history. Patton had disengaged 3 entire divisions from their offensive operations in the Saar and wheeled them 90 degrees north in less than 72 hours of maneuver. That military experts had deemed impossible. On Christmas Day, 1944, the first Sherman tanks of the 4th Armored Division appeared on the horizon south of Bastogne. The siege was about to be broken, but at a cost that would forever mark this small Belgian town as hallowed ground. In American military history, December 26, 1944, the roar of Sherman tank engines crescendoed across the frozen fields south of Bastogne as Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams led Combat Command Baker of the 4th Armored Division in the final push to break the German siege. Behind him, the entire Third Army, nearly 300,000 men, was executing what General George Patton called the most brilliant operation we have thus far performed. "There's Bastogne," shouted Sergeant Charles Boggess, pointing through the vision blocks of his Sherman tank toward the smoke-wreathed town in the distance. At exactly 4:45 in the afternoon, Boggess's tank crashed through the German lines near the village of Assenois, becoming the first Allied vehicle to reach the beleaguered defenders. Inside the perimeter, men who had not seen friendly faces outside their foxholes for 7 days began to weep openly as Patton's spearhead rolled down the main street. Captain Preston Towns, his Easy Company reduced from 140 men to 63 effectives, stood in the snow and saluted the approaching tanks with tears freezing on his cheeks. "About time you got here," called out Brigadier General McAuliffe, grinning beneath his frost-covered mustache as he greeted the relief column commander. The siege of Bastogne was broken, but the Battle of the Bulge was far from over. The German High Command watched their carefully orchestrated offensive begin to crumble with growing desperation. Field Marshal Walter Model, commanding Army Group B, realized that the failure to capture Bastogne had doomed Operation Wacht am Rhein. Without control of the road network, German supplies and reinforcements could not reach the advancing spearheads, while American forces were flowing into the battle area with increasing strength. Hitler, ranting in his underground bunker in Berlin, refused to acknowledge reality. "Bastogne must be taken," he screamed at his generals. "The offensive must continue." But the Führer's demands could not alter the mathematics of logistics and casualties that were steadily bleeding the German army white. The failure was most apparent in the northern sector, where SS General Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army had stalled completely. The elite Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and other premier SS divisions found themselves trapped in a maze of narrow forest roads, their fuel supplies exhausted and their advanced elements cut off by American counterattacks. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, commanding the 1st SS Panzer Regiment's spearhead, had penetrated deepest into American lines, reaching the village of Stoumont before running out of gasoline. His battle group, once the pride of the Waffen-SS, was systematically destroyed by converging American forces that included elements of the 30th Infantry Division and the 82nd Airborne, as documented in post-war interrogation reports held by the National Archives. Piper's retreat became a nightmare of abandoned equipment and desperate rearguard actions. The man who had boasted he would be in Antwerp within 4 days found himself leading the survivors of his regiment on foot through the frozen forests, dodging American patrols and artillery fire. The human cost of the German gamble was becoming apparent in field hospitals and aid stations throughout the Ardennes. Dr. John Pryor, a battalion surgeon with the 101st Airborne, worked without sleep for 72 straight hours treating casualties from both sides. "I've never seen wounds like these," he wrote in his journal. "The cold preserves the bodies, but it also makes every injury potentially fatal." American casualties were equally severe. The 106th Infantry Division had been virtually destroyed in the opening days of the battle, while other units suffered losses approaching 50%. The 4th Infantry Division's 12th Regiment lost over half its strength holding the line near Echternach, and the 28th Infantry Division's 110th Regiment ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. But American industrial might was beginning to tell. For every tank the Germans lost, they had no replacement. For every experienced pilot shot down, there was no trained successor. The United States, by contrast, could replace both men and machines at a rate that dwarfed German production capacity. On December 28th, the weather cleared completely, allowing the Allied air forces to unleash their full fury against German positions. Wave after wave of fighter bombers swept across the battlefield, their rockets and machine guns turning German supply columns into burning wreckage. The Luftwaffe, committing its last reserves in a desperate attempt to gain air superiority, lost over 300 aircraft in 3 days' losses it could never replace. General Patton, his Third Army now fully committed to the Bastogne sector, began planning the counteroffensive that would drive the Germans back to their starting positions. "We're going to go through them like crap through a goose," he told his staff officers, using the colorful language that had made him famous throughout the army. But the cost of victory would be measured in thousands of American lives and the destruction of entire communities throughout the Ardennes. The real test now was whether the battered Allied forces could maintain their momentum and drive the invaders back across the German border before winter weather brought operations to a halt. January 1st, 1945. The new year arrived not with celebration, but with the thunderous roar of artillery as both armies prepared for the final phase of the Ardennes campaign. General Dwight Eisenhower, finally grasping the full scope of the German offensive, had rushed every available reserve to the battle zone. The Ardennes had become a killing ground where the fate of Western Europe would be decided in blood and snow. Major General Matthew Ridgway's 18th Airborne Corps, comprising the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions plus supporting armor, spearheaded the American counteroffensive from the north. These were elite troops, veterans of Sicily, Italy, Normandy, and Holland, but even they had never faced conditions like those in the frozen forests of Belgium. "I fought from North Africa to Normandy," said Colonel James Gavin, commanding the 82nd Airborne, "but I've never seen men suffer like this." His paratroopers, still lacking proper winter equipment, fought in temperatures that plunged to 20 degrees below zero. Weapons froze, medical plasma turned to ice, and men died as much from exposure as from German bullets. The German retreat, when it finally began, proved every bit as bloody as their initial advance. SS General Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, once the spearhead of Hitler's offensive, found itself trapped between converging American forces with nowhere to run. The elite Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division, reduced to a few hundred survivors, made its final stand in the village of Stavelot. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Franklin, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 119th Infantry Regiment, led the assault on Stavelot with grim determination. His men had been fighting continuously for 3 weeks, and their faces bore the hollow-eyed stare of soldiers pushed beyond human endurance. "We went through that town house by house," Franklin later recalled. "The SS fought like fanatics to the end." The battle for Stavelot epitomized the savage fighting that characterized the final phase of the Bulge campaign. Young American soldiers, many fighting their first battle just weeks earlier, now moved through ruined buildings with the mechanical precision of veterans. They had learned the hard lessons of infantry combat: check every corner, trust no surrender, and never leave wounded behind. According to combat historian S.L.A. Marshall's extensive post-war interviews documented in Bastogne the story of the first 8 days. The psychological toll on both armies was unprecedented. Men who had endured weeks of combat in sub-zero temperatures without adequate shelter or medical care began showing symptoms that military psychiatrists had never encountered before. Captain Harry Summers, a company commander in the 26th Infantry Division, reported that 30% of his men were suffering from what would later be recognized as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. They couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, jumped at every sound. He wrote in his after-action report, "Some of the toughest soldiers I knew were reduced to crying children." The German situation was even more desperate. Oberst Otto Skorzny's 150 Panzer Brigade, originally tasked with capturing the Meuse River bridges, had been reduced to scattered groups of survivors hiding in the forests. The vaunted SS divisions that had spearheaded the offensive were shadows of their former selves, their ranks filled with hastily conscripted teenagers and old men dragged from civilian occupations. The Malmedy massacre, perpetrated by troops of the 1st SS Panzer Division, became a rallying cry for American forces throughout the remaining weeks of the battle. Sergeant Kenneth Ohrens, one of the few survivors of the massacre, had played dead among the corpses for 3 hours before escaping to American lines. His testimony, given to war crimes investigators, provided stark evidence of SS atrocities that would later be prosecuted at Nuremberg. The discovery of the massacre site galvanized American troops with a fury that German commanders had not anticipated. Units that had been fighting a professional war suddenly turned savage, and reports of American soldiers refusing to take SS prisoners became common throughout the front lines. By January 8th, the German salient had been compressed into a narrow corridor barely 10 miles wide. Model's Army Group B, which had begun the offensive with over 100,000 men, could barely field 50,000 effective troops. The cream of the German army in the west, the 6th SS Panzer Army, the 5th Panzer Army, and supporting formations had been systematically destroyed in 3 weeks of brutal fighting. General Patton's 3rd Army, advancing from the south, linked up with British forces under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery attacking from the north. Near the town of Hofelice, the German Bulge had been eliminated, and Hitler's last desperate gamble lay in ruins across the blood-soaked forests of the Ardennes. But the cost of victory was staggering. American casualties exceeded 80,000 men, making the Battle of the Bulge the bloodiest engagement in U.S. military history. Entire divisions had been shattered and would require months to rebuild, while the psychological scars would haunt survivors for decades to come. January 28, 1945. The guns finally fell silent across the Ardennes as the last German stragglers crossed back into their homeland, leaving behind the frozen corpses of Hitler's final offensive. The Battle of the Bulge was over, but its consequences would echo through the remainder of the war and beyond. General Dwight Eisenhower stood in the ruins of Bastogne, surveying the devastation that surrounded the small Belgian town that had become synonymous with American courage. Broken tanks littered the streets like discarded toys, while the walls of every building bore the pockmarks of bullets and shrapnel. The smell of death hung heavy in the frigid air, a constant reminder of the price paid for victory. "We held," said Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, limping slightly from shrapnel wounds received during the final German assault on January 4th. His 101st Airborne Division had suffered over 3,000 casualties. During the siege, the human cost was staggering on both sides. American losses totaled 89,000 men killed, wounded, or missing, the highest casualty count for any single battle in U.S. history. The 106th Infantry Division had been virtually annihilated, losing over 8,000 men in the opening days. The 28th Infantry Division's regiments existed only on paper, their survivors scattered among replacement units throughout the theater. But German losses were catastrophic. Of the 250,000 men who had begun Operation Wacht am Rhein on December 16th, fewer than 100,000 returned to German lines in fighting condition. The 6th SS Panzer Army, once the elite of Hitler's forces, could barely field a single division's worth of effective troops. The 5th Panzer Army had lost 80% of its armor and was incapable of further offensive operations. Lieutenant Colonel Joachim Peiper, the SS officer whose spearhead had penetrated deepest into American lines, reflected on the campaign's outcome during his post-war interrogation. "We gambled everything on one throw of the dice," he admitted. "When we failed to reach the Meuse in the first 48 hours, the operation was doomed. After that, we were just feeding men into a meat grinder." The strategic implications of Germany's defeat in the Ardennes were immediately apparent to military analysts on both sides. The failure of that gamble meant Germany could now fight only a defensive war with rapidly diminishing resources, as documented in the official U.S. Army history. The Ardennes Battle of the Bulge by Hugh Cole. The German offensive had actually accelerated the end of the war in Europe by several months. The forces destroyed in the Ardennes could have been used to defend the Rhine River line or the approaches to Berlin, potentially extending German resistance well into the summer of 1945. Field Marshal Walter Model, who had commanded the German forces with skill and determination throughout the campaign, drew the obvious conclusion. In a private communication to Wehrmacht High Command, he stated, "The failure of WACT am Rhine has sealed Germany's fate. We no longer possess the strength to prevent Allied victory." For the American Army, the Battle of the Bulge represented both triumph and tragedy. Units that had entered the fight as green replacements emerged as battle-hardened veterans, but at a cost that would haunt the survivors forever. The 82nd and 100 and 1st Airborne Divisions had added new battle honors to their colors, while formations like the 4th and 9th Armored Divisions had proven their worth. In the crucible of combat, the psychological impact on individual soldiers was profound. Thousands of other veterans would carry similar memories for the rest of their lives, unable to fully explain to their families the hell they had endured in the frozen forests of Belgium. The people of the Ardennes paid perhaps the heaviest price of all. Towns like Bastogne, Saint-Vith, and Malmedy lay in ruins, their civilian population scattered as refugees throughout Western Europe. Entire villages had been erased from the map, their inhabitants killed or driven from homes their families had occupied for generations. Yet, from the ashes of destruction came renewal. The Marshall Plan would rebuild the Ardennes more prosperous than before, while the shared sacrifice of American and European soldiers forged bonds that would become the foundation of the NATO alliance. The Battle of the Bulge proved that democratic nations, when threatened with extinction, could summon reserves of courage and determination that totalitarian regimes could never match. On March 7, 1945, less than 6 weeks after the Ardennes campaign ended, American troops crossed the Rhine River at Remagen. The war in Europe would end just 2 months later, with Germany's unconditional surrender. The Battle of the Bulge stands as testament to the courage of ordinary soldiers who faced extraordinary circumstances and prevailed. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, American G is learned that freedom's price is eternal vigilance and sometimes the ultimate sacrifice. This historical narrative draws upon extensive primary source materials, veteran interviews, and official military histories to recreate one of World War II's most significant battles. The courage and sacrifice of all who served during the Battle of the Bulge must never be forgotten.